We all know about how Christopher Columbus disembarked in America in 1492, establishing the first long-term connection between the Old and New Worlds. However, we also, at least probably, know that it was preceded by the Norse. Around the 11th century AD, Norsemen, led by Leif Erikson, became the first world warriors to land on the continent. This land, called Vinland by the Vikings, was settled by them. However, the settlements did not last, with them being abandoned 10 to 15 years ago. The Vikings retreated to Greenland, which had been colonized a few years prior to the establishment of the Vinland colony. This colony, too, would die out with the migration of the Thule peoples to the south. So, how did the Vinland colony die out? One word: tension. Over the 15-year-long history of the colony, the Vikings had sour relations with the native peoples of the region, constantly engaging in battle with the natives. This, combined with the great distance from Greenland and Europe, crushed Finland, with the settlements being abandoned by 1015 AD. But what if that had not occurred? What if the Vikings remained in Vinland? How would such a change impact history? What would the world look like today? So how do we get the Vikings to survive in Vinland? The most obvious answer is to get the Vikings to ease relations with the natives. Maybe Leaf realizes in this timeline that the Vikings are so outnumbered and so cut off from the rest of their territories for conflict for the natives to occur. As far-fetched as this might seem, this isn't too unlikely. As said in the previous video, Iceland forbade any killing or warfare as their population was too low for that to be tolerated. In fact, Leif's brother of a father, Eric the Red, was banished from Iceland for killing the man who killed his slaves. So, a sentence like this being established in Vinland is not too unlikely. Another thing that caused the Viking colony to fail was that it was cut off from the rest of the areas the Norse settled. The Vikings were dependent on places like Greenland and Iceland for loads of things. Naval technology in this era was not of the quality for regular trade between areas separated by such great distances. If you watched the last video, remember that Vinland and Greenland were both discovered by accident, not on purpose, and the same went to places like the Faroes and Iceland. In this timeline, tranquility established with the natives would give the Vikings time to develop enough to eventually reach the point of self-reliance and not to be dependent on foreign regions for supplies. One more thing, Scandinavians seem to have an interest in this region. Some have proposed that the Vikings really didn't even make an attempt to colonize. For this timeline to work, the Vikings will have to make a strong effort to colonize North America. So now we have created a world that the Viking colony in Vinland can survive in. So what would the effect of a Viking colony in the Americas would have? It is around 1030 AD. The Vikings have been in the Americas for around 3 decades, establishing a ring of settlements in modern-day Newfoundland and Labrador and the Canadian Maritimes, with possibly a slight presence in Quebec and northern New England. The Vikings would probably establish a confederacy or commonwealth similar to that of Iceland or Greenland, likely based around Leavesbitter or modern-day Longstock Meadows at the tip of the Great Northern Peninsula due to its central location. The Vikings would likely hug the coast due to their seafaring culture and easier access to trade and travel. Additionally, this area of Canada is right rich in fjords, where the Vikings tended to settle in. Contact with the natives would usher in somewhat of a mini Columbian exchange between the Vikings and natives. The Vikings would give the natives iron, weeds, and advanced naval technology, as well as Eurasian livestock, while the Vikings would likely get things like native crops. Once the Vikings would get numerous enough, disease would also play a major factor. Frontier societies tend to have extraordinarily high birth rates, and so the Vikings, although originally small, would likely quickly multiply, likely having a population of around 50,000 by the end of the 11th century. This population growth would be further propelled by immigration from colonies like areas like Iceland and Norway, and especially Greenland. In all honesty, Vinland and surrounding areas would seem pretty attractive. It was temperate, huge, and with some minor exceptions, was ideal for agriculture. Expect massive immigration to the region, pushing the frontier west. The native peoples, meanwhile, would likely utilize their access to European technology. Groups like the Dorset, Proto-Innu, and Proto-Beothuk would benefit hugely as they would be the ones with immediate contact with Vikings. They would get this technology such as iron, horses, etc., and would use it to their advantage. They would likely subdue neighboring tribes who had not acquired European technology, moving further west. Each crushed tribe would gain access to European technology as well, and would use this as an advantage to invade other tribes who do not have this technology, and so on and so forth. Massive conflict would occur in this area, as the introduction of European weaponry from the Vikings would completely reshape the balance of power in this region. Vikings, being good sailors and explorers, would explore the coasts and hinterland of North America, sailing along the St. Lawrence River and reaching the Great Lakes and exploring the American East Coast. They would likely establish trading posts in these regions, especially in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence. The introduction of European technology especially impacted this region, as this region was the closest to the areas like Chakioya and Mississippian peoples. These people were highly advanced and urbanized, being based around the Mississippi River. The introduction of European technology truly propels these peoples into being full-blown civilizations. The East Coast was also benefit possible civilization being established here. Once the Norsemen would get numerous enough, diseases would begin to have a major impact on native peoples, which would be exacerbated by the introduction of European livestock like cattle. Contraction of old world diseases would wipe out 90% of the population in these areas, like it did in later centuries. This would leave up empty space for the Vikings to move in and colonize, which would be further exacerbated by the arrival of other Europeans. Over time, news about Vinland would gradually spread from Iceland and Greenland to the rest of Europe. Courts, nobles, knights, clergymen, merchants, and peasants of Europe would learn of a fertile land to the west, plentiful with wine and fertile land. This would spark several events, both in Europe and Vinland. Europe during this era was experiencing enormous population growth caused by the introduction of feudalism, improved plough design to the thick clay coastal areas of northern Europe, increased stability, and the Vikings made better trade connections throughout the continent. Additionally, the end of the Magyar Wars and the ending of the Viking Age had left a ton of landless nobles and knights who wanted land, money, and fame. You can very much make the argument that key factor in the beginning of the Crusades was because of this. I don't fully agree with this theory, but this would be ideal for massive migration to the Americas. But it did see massive expansion in medieval Europe, and so it isn't far-fetched that similar expansion would occur in the Americas. And this timeline, some of this excess population would migrate west towards the depopulated regions of the American East Coast and eastern Canada. Europeans of all stripes, English or French, peasant or noble, Gothic or Cathar, etc., would establish independent states in this new world, likely aided with the Crusaders, further pushing the natives to the periphery. The 12th and 13th centuries would see massive expansion of the European colonies in the east coast, likely stopping when they hit the Appalachians and probably the Great Lakes. Areas like Greenland, Iceland, and the Kingdom of the Isles would grow more influential as the trade between the Americas and Europe would require stopping these places to the sheer distance. This would make these geographical choke points of centers of trade. This would have the primary effect of boosting these regions' power and strengthening Norse culture and influence. The Kingdom of the Isles would likely resist to a Scottish invasion, for example, and the colony of Greenland with its bloated numbers and importance would never die out. There's a theory called the Axial Age. Basically describes a period from around the 8th century BC to the 7th century AD, in which we saw the rise of almost all of our modern religions, such as Christianity and Buddhism. This occurred during which times were greatly changing. In general, people clinging on their beliefs until the world has been altered so much that their beliefs no longer make sense. This is what the Axial Age was. Large empires and better travel connections exposed people to other ideas. The old faiths could not keep up and most were subdued by Axial Age religions. The reason I'm talking about this is due to one word: Christianity. European presence in the Americas would introduce Christianity to natives. Most native faiths were barely organized pre-Axial Age religions at best. This would make it extremely easy for Christianity, an organized Axial Age faith, to convert to natives to Christianity. Christianity spread throughout much of the lands east of the Mississippi, where advanced civilizations were. The colonies would probably receive a massive population boost with a further immigration during the late medieval period, a time of rampant famine and general hardship throughout Europe. This caused the European frontier to move even further, likely sucking up much of the Caribbean, Central Appalachians, and more of Canada. This would lead to a lessening of Europe's population. This would mean that the effects of the late Middle Ages would not be as impactful as it was, since a lot of it was due to Europe's overpopulation, spurred by the massive population explosion of the high Middle Ages. After the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern era, things will become more difficult to predict as the world becomes more so altered that the chances of exact predictions being incorrect skyrocket. However, there's still a few long-term predictions I can make. By this time, the Europeans were be in contact with the natives long enough for the tribes of the Great Plains to gain access to horses. The introduction of horses would turn these tribes into the Mongols of Turks of the New World, wreaking havoc on the civilized world. Expect Sul Genghis Khans to periodically go on rampages and slaughter millions of people. Tribes of Great Plains in general, tribes that remained in America, would be greatly impacted with the arrival of gunpowder in the region. Gunpowder is the only thing that gave civilized peoples an advantage of the tribes, and so when the age of gunpowder dawned, there was a massive worldwide push to force the nomads off their land. The Aztecs and whatever analog state would exist in this timeline, as well as the Europeans and Mississippian states, would push into the Great Plains, pushing off the natives and settling the region with their own people. The land would become incredibly fertile as the sedentary people would farm the land. We saw this in places like Russia, where, for example, the Russians annexed the Turkish possessions in and around Crimea. They settled the lands and turned it into steppe pasture lands inhabited by nomads into one of the most fertile regions on Earth. Similar processes would occur in the Americas. The transatlantic slave trade would have not occurred. In our timeline, the transatlantic slave trade began because the natives who were originally enslaved began dying off due to the European diseases. By the time the Europeans would have arrived in the tropics, the natives would have already grown immune to Eurasian diseases, meaning that the transatlantic slave trade would serve no purpose, as the Europeans can simply just use the natives to harvest labor-intensive crops like tobacco, sugar. The civilizations of Mesoamerica and the Inca would thrive in this timeline. By the time the Europeans would have arrived, they would have had a technological level equal to that of the Europeans and would be large centralized states. Invading simply between these areas would likely been impossible. Without the European conquest and the introduction of European technology to the region, the Aztec and Incas would likely be able to throw their weight around. I've already mentioned how the Aztecs would use gunpowder to soup the nomadic peoples of the Great Plains. Meanwhile, the Aztecs would likely subdue the Yucatan Peninsula and drive down south to Panama, thus giving them to control the trade between America and Asia, and thus generating massive amounts of wealth from that. There's also the possibility that they would have subdued California. The Inca, meanwhile, would expand south into modern-day Argentina and Paraguay, but by then their supply lines would be so overstretched that their possessions in Argentina and Paraguay would likely split off. The west coast would likely be split between the Russians and the Aztecs. This area is so cut off from the rest of the continent that by the time that the Aztecs would have arrived, these areas would likely only now be beginning of European technology at best, making them incredibly vulnerable. As we said, the Aztecs would likely subdue California. The American Cascadia is too far removed from central authority in Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs would likely be severely overstretched, and even if the natives were severely behind logically, they could simply revolt and force the Aztecs out. Syria likely see a series of proto-civilizations develop until the Russians would thrust into the region and fill in the void left by the Aztecs. Christianity was spread into the Aztec Empire, and was causing many injurious effects. The Aztec religion was a horrible pre-X-Age religion based on the sacrifice of millions of humans' lives that was probably would not be able to stand the chance against Christianity. On the other hand, Aztec society was a peace-run society that may have been able to defend against Christianity. The Aztec Empire would probably experience a human power type of rebellion like revolt sometime in the early modern period. If the Christians were victorious, the Aztecs would be able to fully westernize, probably become the dominant power in the Americas. If the conservatives won, the Aztec Empire would resemble that of China during the century of humiliation, a backward water constantly being humiliated by foreign powers. Despite massive territorial losses and other acts of humility being inflicted upon the Aztecs. In South America, meanwhile, the Europeans were able to thrust their influence in the region sometime in the second millennium. By then, naval technology would advance to such point that these regions were part of the European state proper, unlike the colonies further north. The main colonizers would likely be the Spanish and Portuguese. With Peru, Mexico not remaining under Aztec control, Spanish would never become the major European player, or become at least as important as they were in our time. Looked at the massive gold and silver deposits of Peru and Mexico. The primary effects of this would be that France would become the dominant European power, with it being the most powerful, populous, people, and militant state on the continent after the Hundred Years' War. In general, the Americas would look something along these lines, with Europeans populating most of the East Coast in Canada, Mississippians populating most of the Ohio River Valley, and Aztecs controlling northern Latin America. The Great Plains would be partitioned between the Aztecs, Mississippians, and Europeans. In South America, meanwhile, the Inca would be able to control all of the Pacific coast, while having the descendant states in Patagonia and La Plata. Brazil will be colonized by the Portuguese like in our timeline, and the rest of South America will be Spanish. The Caribbean, meanwhile, will be a mixture of European and native states. In general, the natives will retain much of their land, and the European conquest will be incomplete. Thank you for watching. Consider liking and sharing this video and subscribing if you have not. If you didn't like the video, feel free to dislike. I don't care. As always, thank you.